things on people who wouldn't have had it available to them. And also before people were able to transition in the way we understand it now, of like being able to have surgery or take hormones or puberty blockers if you're a child, can we say that people transitioned? But the obvious objection to that would be that not all trans people now choose to use surgery or hormones in order to transition. So, and there are many examples throughout history of people living as a different sex from which they were born for at least part of their lives, as well as many who deviated from the norms of their biological sex. So yeah, one of the ways that Susan Stryker defines transgender, Tanya said earlier, was people who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth. And so if you were kind of going by that definition, then most of the people I'm discussing, so most of the female husbands, for example, in Jen Mannion's book, would fall into that category. Yeah, so people have different ideas on what terminology to use. So Jen Mannion uses trans as a verb because she says that it doesn't assert any kind of fixed identity on them. So it's more kind of just explaining the narrative without claiming to know their motivations. And she uses they, them for all of the female husbands in her book because one, she says that she thinks it's very powerful to use the gender neutral pronoun, and two, because she's talking about people at different times in their life. So it could get confusing if she were to switch between like saying one pronoun when they seem to be clearly presenting as women and then one pronoun when they seem to be clearly presenting as men. And so Katie Sutton, who wrote a book on masculinity, female masculinity in Weimar Germany, uses passing to talk about people who are living as men in their lives, but who are born female, because of its potential to encompass multiple meanings beyond cross-dressing. But she acknowledges that it can be a slightly problematic term. And she also uses transvestite because that's the term that was being used by the sexologists at the time, and also by members of the queer subculture were identifying themselves as transvestite. And her pronoun use varies. So for one of the people she discusses, she uses she/her, her/him whenever she refers to them. But for others, she will do a choice of pronouns based on if it seems like they are identifying themselves more clearly in that way. So one of the reasons why it can be so complicated to talk about trans identity in the past is because of the conflation between homosexuality and transgressing gender roles. So particularly because of the theory of the sexual invert that came from sexology was all about that, you would behave like the opposite sex and you would be attracted to your own sex. So the two ideas were quite combined. And obviously because people do often will transgress gender roles as part of their homosexual identity. So it can be quite hard to tell whether people considered the fact that they were dressing as a man or presenting in various masculine ways as them being a man, or if they considered it as just part of being homosexual. I said about men because it's more clear with men, male to female transvestites. They get earlier recognition that it's separate from homosexuality because they tend to, they get recognition in lesbian magazines in Weimar Germany that they have transvestite sections which tend to address male to female transvestites and less so female to male. So this is an example of an article in Die Freundin, which is one of the lesbian magazines of Weimar Germany, where despite the fact that it is a queer subcultural magazine, they deny the gender of the person discussed, despite the fact that they'd passed as a man for 23 years up until their death. They insist on describing them as female and talking about their relationship as a homosexual relationship. So there's quite a lot of kind of disagreement about whether, there's lots of problems with kind of lesbian history claiming people who it's unclear whether they're transing gender or whether they are, you know, going more of a like proto-butch sort of identity, and that describing relationships between, say, the female husbands and their wives as homosexual is accurate or not, because that's kind of erasing their identity if they are trying to, if they themselves are seeing it as heterosexual because they believe themselves to be men. So that's kind of quite a complex thing. And also, so I think I quite like Jen Mannion's thing of using trans as a verb, because I think that works quite well for discussing like more complex cases as well. So that it's not just about, that kind of in the kind of proto-butch identity that is in itself a transing of gender, even if you are still identifying as a woman. Clearly, you are like still kind of, it's an identity of its own in both kind of sexual and gender terms, which is something that Jack Halberstam talks about a lot in one of her books. And also just because I'm obsessed with Anne Lister, that kind of using transing works for her as well, because she clearly identifies herself as a woman and says she doesn't want to be a man, but she also experiences discomfort with elements of her that are too feminine or too masculine in what kind of seems quite similar to gender dysphoria. And she also like clearly tries to take on aspects of masculine presentation, but like, you know, says that she is a woman and she doesn't wish that she had been born a man, like some of her girlfriends suggest her. Bibliography.
Fantastic. Sorry, I was so deep in reflecting on Anne Lister there, everything that I hadn't realised you'd come to